On today's episode, we're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the Philadelphia Eagles, plus all my fantasy studs for Week 10, coming right up. And what is up, everyone? You're listening to the Gridiron Fantasy Football Podcast for Monday, November 16th, 2020. And I am Chip. I'm your host. Thank you so much for listening today. If you're a new listener, thank you so much for joining us as well. If you'd like to share our podcast, you can find us over on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music. If you'd like to watch us, you can watch us over on YouTube at Gridiron Fantasy Football. So do me a favor, hit subscribe, hit the bell so you don't miss any more episodes. Help support the show. And on today's episode, we're going to talk about all my Week 10 reactions to all the games, all the fantasy studs for Week 10. But before we do that, let's go ahead and go into some of the news for Monday. And I'm going to start off right off the bat. Kansas City Chiefs coach Andy Reid has signed an extension with the Chiefs, which is good news. I mean, we had a feeling the longer that Patrick Mahomes is with that team, they have that team assembled. That team is good to go for the next 4 to 5 years. I think that they have a chance to win multiple championships. I'm not sure if it will be the same type of dominance like the Patriots had with their dynasty, but everything's trending upwards, so it's good to see that Andy Reid gets his extension. I love Andy Reid. I like seeing him coach. I like seeing the teams that he's able to assemble. I like how his coaching style is and how innovative he is. So good news for the Kansas City Chiefs. Now going on to some of the injuries that took place for Week 10. I'm going to start off going off with Teddy Bridgewater. In the game yesterday against the Bucs, Teddy Bridgewater went down after getting hit, and diagnosis came back, said he had an MCL sprain. It looks like he will be day-to-day. Matt Rule of the Panthers, the coach, said that he wants to see if he practices on Wednesday to determine if he's going to be able to go on Sunday. But that's good news. Hopefully that it's minor. It's kind of the same injury that Big Ben has dealt with last week. Big Ben was able to go back into the locker room, get a knee brace on. More likely got an injection. He came back to play. Now, when Teddy Bridgewater went down, he went down in the fourth quarter, so there was really no point to bring him back. So hopefully he can get back on the field for Week 11. And then Saints quarterback Drew Brees. Drew Brees was knocked out of Week 10 with a rib injury. So apparently from the reports that I've been reading, that he was dealing with the rib injury even before Week 10. And then reports came out today saying that he has 5 fractured ribs. And then on top of that, he has a collapsed lung on the right side. Now, we don't know exactly the severity. Obviously, the collapsed lung is the most concerning. But there hasn't been anything that has been reported that he has been hospitalized. So that could be encouraging to say the least if you look through the silver lining and everything. But with that being the case, it looks like Jameis Winston will be the starter. However, Sean Payton has not declared that yet, so I'm not sure why head coaches do this. I mean, Jameis Winston was the guy who came in for Drew Brees when he got hurt, so everyone assumes that's going to be Taysom Hill. I think that they have a combination of using both. I think they're going to still use Taysom Hill like they've been using him. Just Taysom Hill, to me, is not an every down quarterback, so I don't see him being the guy that will take over that starting role. But, Drew Brees was dealing with the shoulder injury way before this. Now he's dealing with the ribs. Now the collapsed lung, so Drew Brees will be missing some time. Now it's a matter who do you pick up on your waiver wire? Is it Jameis Winston or Taysom Hill? If I had to guess today, it's going to be Jameis Winston. He's the more polished quarterback. So that's just my opinion as of right now, but that could change as the information comes in. And then looking at the Rams left tackle Andrew Whitworth, he was placed on IR due to a torn MCL and damage to his PCL. Now, reason why I bring him up, usually I don't bring up offensive linemen too much in these injury updates because, it depends on the offense and the players that it involves. But with the Rams, they just signed him to a 3-year deal in March, and now he's injured. And honestly, I think this really hurts Jared Goff because Jared Goff has not done well under pressure this year. And Whitworth was a guy that was, obviously, he was protecting him. And now that he's gone, they play the Bucs on Monday night, in Week 11. And I'm concerned about Jared Goff. I'm concerned about what the pressure, because the Bucs are a very blitz-happy team. So if Jared Goff can't, recognize the blitz packages and where the blitzes are coming from, I can see him having a hard time with the Bucs on Monday night. So that's just my opinion, but that injury is more significant than people probably realize. And then going on to the Miami Dolphins have released Jordan Howard. When Myles Gaskins went down, we weren't sure who was going to be that starter. Then Matt Breida, there was more reports that Matt Breida was going to be the starter. He goes out with a hamstring injury. He's been out the last couple of weeks. And then Jordan Howard should have been the guy that would have taken that starting role. Now, he did in week 9, but in week 10, he was a healthy scratch. And then Ahmed was the guy that they had played and had actually had a decent game. So my guess is if Myles Gaskin continues to be out, which he will be, he'll miss another game. Salvon Ahmed will be the guy who's going to be the starter. So I think he's a good waiver wire pickup. I'll talk about him on tomorrow's episode, but it'll be interesting to see who Jordan Howard gets picked up by. There's a lot of running back needy teams right now due to injury, and it'll be interesting to kind of see where he goes. But he'll be on waivers, and we'll see who he gets picked up by. But that's all the news for Monday. Now I want to go over all the top plays for Week 10. Now this is based on Next Gen Stats, so I always go reference them when I look at the top plays. And honestly, for the fastest ball carrier, that goes to Ronald Jones. He reached a top speed of 21.19 miles per hour on his 98-yard rushing touchdown. Very surprising, being a Bucs fan and watching how bad they were rushing the ball last week, and then seeing them come out and just dominate the running game this week was very encouraging. And this 98-yard run was the longest play in Bucs history, so it was cool to see that. And then going to the longest play for Week 10, and that goes to Carolina Panthers kick returner Trenton Cannon. Now, he ran a distance of 123.8 yards on his 98-yard kickoff return. He almost had that touchdown, but he got knocked out at the 2. So, but that's crazy to think that he ran 123.8 yards. And then going to the improbable completion, this goes to Kyler Murray and to DeAndre Hopkins. Now, this was the touchdown-winning Hail Mary. Obviously, this has been the top play of the week. Crazy finish of that game. But they had a completion probability of 16.9%. And I looked at that stat, and I was like, that's very surprising to me, because if you look at what Hail Mary is like, usually a Hail Mary is just a prayer to see if the player comes down with the catch. And I would think based on, DeAndre Hopkins had 3 players around him, and you look at the catch probability of 16.9% on a play that a throw was just put up in the air like that, I would expect the probability percentage, the completion probability percentage to be a little bit lower than that, but 16.9% seems a little high. But I'm not a sports science guy. I don't designate all that stuff. So, but based on Next Gen Stats, it was the lowest completion percentage for the week. But crazy finish to that Bills and Cardinals game. Great game to watch. And then going to the remarkable rushes. Now this goes to Ronald Jones again. On his 98-yard touchdown rush, he was only expected to get 4 yards. And he ended up running 94 yards over expected. So, like I said, a great run, great game by Ronald Jones. And then the fastest sack goes to Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, the strong safety of the Saints. He was able to sack Nick Mullins in 2.84 seconds. So this is also surprising to me. I was surprised to see a safety get the fastest sack rather than a linebacker or a defensive lineman. So pretty interesting stat there. So those are all the top plays for Week 10. Now we're going to jump into all of the reactions to all the games. And I'm going to start off with the Bucs versus the Panthers. We saw with the Bucs last week just laying 8 against the Saints, and they came back strong, and they won 46-23 against the Panthers. Now we can say, obviously the Panthers are a team in a rebuild mode in a sense, and the Bucs just, they had to come out and show that what they did last week was an anomaly of what we should expect from them. So they went back to what they're known for, and that's rushing the football and using those shorter routes to move the chains. And we finally saw them run the ball effectively. Obviously Ronald Jones almost had 200 yards rushing. Brady had 341 yards passing with 3 touchdown passes and a QB sneak touchdown. So this is the formula for the Bucs to win. They need to be able to rush the ball so they can open up the pass, the play action, the intermediate routes, all that stuff. That needs to be what they win and how they win and how they should be going forward. But great game by, Brady, Ronald Jones, Godwin, Evans. Evans scored, but if you're in a PPR format, pretty much across the board, all the Bucs had decent fantasy outings. Now, obviously, their upside is very capped because they have so many weapons. But I do believe, obviously we saw, Brown got more involved. Antonio Brown got more involved. We saw Gronk score. We saw Brate score. So this is the formula. Now it's depending on who's going to be that fantasy star. I just think the guy that you want is going to be Ronald Jones and Tom Brady. For the receivers, they're just going to be capped. So that's just my opinion. But on the Panther side of the ball, DJ Moore had a very good game. Now on the flip side, the people who had bad games this game was Mike Davis. You expected, the Bucs have a really strong front seven. They obviously have a very good rush defense. So Mike Davis did not have a very good game. Robbie Anderson was pretty quiet, and so was Curtis Samuel. I know Curtis Samuel has been a guy that people were picking up on the waiver wire, but he was a guy that just didn't play up to what we expected based on the opportunities, especially with Christian McCaffrey being out. But it's just one of those things where, you try to chase the points, and sometimes that happens. Sometimes you miss out on the week that he just has a dud. So I think that Curtis Samuel, he still has a role in this offense. It's just going to be a matter of, if Teddy Bridgewater plays, if the backup's going to be in there. It just all depends now. It's just hard to determine that. So now we're going to go on to the Browns versus the Texans. Now the Browns won this game 10-7. This game was delayed because of bad weather and hail. And it was a very, from a fantasy standpoint, depending on who you played, it was an ugly game. I mean, nobody could do anything in this other than Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. You pretty much had nobody else do well for you in fantasy. I mean, you saw Deshaun Watson, he had a touchdown. Baker Mayfield had just under 6 points fantasy-wise, which this was a good streaming game for him. But you can't, when we make these predictions and the probabilities of players being good or bad for certain games, you can't predict what the weather's going to be like. You can't predict how that's going to affect them. Now, obviously, if you see weather like that, if you saw the Sunday Night Football game, you would think that Lamar Jackson would have a bad game because the fact that it's very wet, windy, but you end up having a good fantasy game. So it's hard to predict that. But Baker Mayfield, they stayed away from passing the ball. They gave the ball to Nick Chubb, and both Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb had over 100 yards. Obviously, Nick Chubb had a touchdown, and they almost had a second touchdown, but he ended up going out of bounds, which was pretty funny to me because apparently a lot of, obviously if you gamble on these games, obviously that score would have won a lot of people a lot of money. Fantasy-wise, if you're down by a certain amount of points and you lost by the difference of that touchdown, that has to be frustrating. So not to put salt in the wound, but that could be a reason why you guys don't win your matchups because Nick Chubb he did what Todd Gurley was supposed to do, but Nick Chubb could have just stayed in bounds and then let the clock run out. But he decided to stop the clock, and there's no way the Texans were going to, even if the Browns scored a touchdown, they'll be up 17-7. There would be no way that the Texans were going to be able to get, in 56 seconds, get 2 possessions and 2 scores. I don't see that happening. So, but just a funny moment in the game yesterday. And then when it comes to, like I said, the receiving for both teams was very low. I mean, you had Rashard Higgins. He led with 3 catches for 48 yards on 4 targets. I had Austin Hooper as a streamer tight end this week. He was a good option based on the Texans and how bad they are against the tight end. And honestly, I had Hayden Hurst on a bye, so I played Austin Hooper. And he only got 1 catch for 21 yards. But the encouraging thing is, he had 1 catch for 11 yards. And the good thing about it is that he played 80% of the snaps. Now, his target share was only about 10%, but he did play a majority of the snaps, which is good. So, you got to see, you got David Njoku and Harrison Bryant did not record a target. So that's encouraging if you're who picked up Austin Hooper and you want to keep Austin Hooper on your roster, because I do think he's still going to be implemented in the offense. He definitely has a good playoff schedule going forward. So I think Austin Hooper is definitely a keep. And on the Texans side of the ball, I mean, Brandon Cooks, he had a decent game. He had 6 receptions for 39 yards on 8 targets. Will Fuller was 5 for 38 on 8 targets. So, not horrible. I mean, I would say in a PPR, it didn't kill you, but it definitely didn't help you. And then when it comes to rushing the ball, I mean, Duke Johnson had 14 carries for 54 yards. So it's just one of those things where Duke Johnson just didn't have a good game. But overall, like, this game was just complete mess because of the weather. But overall, I mean, I think that if you had played Nick Chubb or Kareem Hunt, you both were happy with those outcomes. And now going on to the Washington football team against the Lions. The Lions won this game 30-27. And, Alex Smith has thrown for over like 700 something yards in the last 2 games. So that's encouraging. He didn't throw a touchdown yesterday, but he didn't have any turnovers either. But, it's still one of those things where it's a very cool story to have Alex Smith back. On the Detroit side of the ball, Matthew Stafford, he was 276 for 3 touchdowns. So good outing for Matthew Stafford. Antonio Gibson, he led the backfield with, 13 carries. And DeAndre Swift finally got a start. He got his first start of the season. He has 16 carries for 81 yards. He added another 5 catches for 68 yards and a touchdown. I think this is DeAndre Swift's season. I think if you held on to him, you're going to be happy going forward because he definitely is the better back, obviously, in that backfield. So he needs to be started. And then when it comes to the receivers, Terry McLaurin had a good game. He was 7 for 95 on 9 targets. This was crazy too, J.D. McKissick. So he's a guy that has very good PPR value. He had 15 targets yesterday. I mean, that is crazy. And Antonio Gibson only had 4. So they obviously like J.D. McKissick out of the backfield as a wide receiver. So I think he's still a good, safe play in PPR formats. On the Lions side of the ball, you had Marvin Jones. He was 8 for 96 and 1. Marvin Hall had a touchdown. So, you probably didn't play Marvin Hall if you are in a 10-team league with smaller rosters. But if you're in a deeper league, Marvin Hall helped you out, yesterday. But overall, I mean, not from a fantasy standpoint, you didn't have any really bad fantasy outings, for this game. So that was good. And then going on to the Jacksonville Jaguars versus the Packers. The Packers won this game 24-20. And honestly, I mean, this is a game where, if you look at what, the Packers are able to do, you look at this matchup. I mean, the Jags, I feel like this game should have been a little bit more dominant by the Packers based on Aaron Rodgers and the running game and the receiving. But, Aaron Rodgers, he definitely had a decent game. He was 325 for 2. So not bad, but it's just one of those things where I would expected him to have one of those, 4 touchdown games against the Jags. Now, obviously, game script, based on, how things are kind of unfolding throughout the game. But I expected more of Aaron Rodgers, but still not a bad fantasy outing. And then when it comes to, like, the backfield, Aaron Jones, kind of a quiet game, 13 for 46. James Robinson on the Jacksonville Jaguars, he was 23 for 109. Now, this was a game in a matchup where I felt like this was a good matchup for him. The Packers are very, very bad against the run. We saw what Dalvin Cook did against, the Packers. Now, I'm not saying obviously that James Robinson's on the same level as Dalvin Cook, but you expected at least a touchdown. He did have over 100 yards. He did have a catch. And he had 2 catches. So I would expect from a fantasy in a PPR standpoint, he had a fine game. It's nice to be able to have that touchdown. But overall, I thought he was going to have a better game than he did. On the receiving side of the ball, I mean, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, he blew up yesterday. He was 4 for 149 and a touchdown. And it's crazy to think that he had a better game than Devontae Adams. I mean, Devontae Adams still scored a touchdown, but it's hard to determine how to look at MVS, right? We looked at Curtis Samuel. Curtis Samuel had a few weeks of good production, and then he laid an egg this past week. And then you look at MVS, and it's like, okay, do I really trust MVS against the Jacksonville Jaguars team because of Devontae Adams? You expect that Devontae Adams was going to eat all day long. And then there was that, is Allen Lazard going to play? It's all these, question marks about, do I want to play? And MVS, he blew up. So, it's one of those things where if you played him, kudos to you. You actually had a really good outing for him, from him. But it's hard to determine, like, with Allen Lazard getting closer and closer coming back. I'm just wondering where that's going to lead. I'm wondering if MVS can stay with that number 2 slot, or is it going to be Allen Lazard? I mean, obviously at the beginning of the season, Allen Lazard was the guy that was the number 2. And then, MVS was wasn't being used as much. So I'm wondering how that's going to play out as the team gets healthier at the wide receiver position. And then on the Jags, DJ Chark, he had 4 receptions for 56 yards, so not the best outing for him. He did have 5 targets. Keelan Cole, he had 5 receptions for 47 yards and a touchdown on 7 targets. So, with Laviska Shenault being out, Keelan Cole obviously had an uptick in target share, and he scored. So it's one of those things where, same thing with the Jags. Like, can you continue to play DJ Chark and trust him based on Jake Luton? Like, does Gardner Minshew come back? So there's a lot of question marks, even with if the wide receivers for the Jags. But overall, I mean, this is one of those games where you weren't really like if you were hoping for blow-ups from like Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams, and you didn't get that, you're probably disappointed, especially with James Robinson. But they didn't hurt you at all either. So overall, not a bad game. And then going on to the New York Giants versus the Eagles. This was a very surprising game to me. I mean, I was shocked that the Giants just kind of handled the Eagles the way they did. They won this game 27-17. And this was the best opportunity for Carson Wentz to finally have majority of his offense back. This should not have been only a 17-point score for the Eagles. I'm very surprised that this game was so lopsided in the sense of what the Eagles could do on offense. I mean, Carson Wentz only had 200 yards passing. He had no touchdowns. Daniel Jones, same thing. He had a stat line of 244 yards passing. However, Daniel Jones had 9 carries for 64 yards and a touchdown. So, like, he didn't do it in the air, but he was able to get you a touchdown on the ground. So most of you didn't play Daniel Jones, but it's one of those things where Daniel Jones has less talent on offense, but he's able to find ways to score. And you had Miles Sanders back, you had Jalen Reagor, you had Dallas Goedert, you had Alshon Jeffrey back, and yet they can't do anything on offense, which is very surprising to me. Like, Miles Sanders, he came back, he led with 15 carries and 85 yards, but the touchdowns went to Boston Scott and Corey Clement. So he did get vultured for touchdowns, but you saw that he was playing majority of the snaps, got majority of the carries, so that's encouraging. Now, when it comes to when the Eagles receivers, Richard Rodgers had 4 receptions for 60 yards on 5 targets. You had Jalen Reagor. He was 4 for 47 on 7 targets, so he led all the Eagles for 7 targets. And then Dallas Goedert, he had 4 receptions for 33 yards on 6 targets. And you look down at Alshon Jeffrey, 1 target with no catches and no yards. So, like, and then Travis Fulgham, he was the waiver wire darling from a few weeks ago. He recorded 1 reception for 8 yards. So, it's just very interesting to kind of see the dynamic of the Eagles and be like, okay, they're in a very easy division, a winnable division, and then they lose to the Giants. So if you're an Eagles fan, this is not me trying to be, negative against your team, but I just felt like this was a opportunity to take that next step forward, be like, we are the top dogs of this division. This whole division is in disarray. Like, you would think that this would be a time where you guys could actually put your mark on the division and have a very significant win against a division opponent. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. But going back to the Giants, Wayne Gallman had a good game. He had 2 touchdowns. He had 18 carries, so he's the lead running back there. Darius Slayton had a good game. He was 5 for 93 on 7 targets. Sterling Shepard was 6 for 47 on 6 targets. But bad game from Evan Ingram. He was 2 for 15, so not a very good game from Evan Ingram, unfortunately. But overall, I mean, just like I said, just a very lopsided game. All right, let's move on to the Denver Broncos versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, this game was interesting too because the Raiders won this game easily, 37-12, and honestly, I didn't realize they scored 37 points. Like, I have the red zone on usually throughout Sunday if I'm not watching like a particular game that I'm invested in. But I did not realize that they scored 37 points. I mean, they are quietly having a very good season. They're 6-3 now. And, Derek Carr, ugly game, only had 154 yards. But this was all, honestly, the backfield for the Raiders. I mean, Josh Jacobs had 112 yards and 2 touchdowns. Devontae Booker had 81 yards for 2 touchdowns. I mean, nobody really did anything from the receiving standpoint. on the Raiders. You had on the Denver side of the ball, Melvin Gordon, he had 11 carries for 46 yards. I mean, that's not going to help you win fantasy games. And then you had Philip Lindsay had 4 carries for 2 yards. Just this Denver Broncos team, this is a very, very hard team to kind of figure out. I mean, going forward, do you really want to play Melvin Gordon anymore? I mean, I feel like that's just now becoming a very evident thing that Melvin Gordon just can't be trusted. I mean, I'm sure you can find other people out there. Maybe you don't, but maybe you have to play Melvin Gordon because of your roster structure. But I don't think that he's a guy that you can really play much anymore. It's just unfortunate that he's a very talented running back. Don't get me wrong, but for him to have this much of a struggle, it's just interesting to me. But from the Broncos standpoint, from the wide receiver perspective, I mean, Jerry Jeudy had 4 catches for 68 yards. You had Tim Patrick, who was 4 for 61. KJ Hamler was 4 for 50. He led with 10 targets. I mean, obviously this is not, great fancy outings, but, you got to look at the opportunities. I mean, Drew Lock, he had 4 interceptions yesterday, so you can't really do anything when you have 4 interceptions. I mean, Drew Lock, I like Drew Lock. He was one of my guys I felt like could have a breakout season, and I think he's just being very careless with the ball. So, unfortunately, I've obviously am not on the Derek or the Drew Lock bandwagon anymore. He's just not doing it for me. So now moving on to the Miami Dolphins versus the Chargers. I mean, the Dolphins are looking very good. They won this game 29-21. They go to 6-3. I mean, a lot of people are not talking about the Miami Dolphins. I mean, Tua continues to look better every single week. He had 2 touchdown passes. He didn't have a lot of yardage, but he was smart with the football. He didn't turn over the ball at all. I mean, Justin Herbert, he was 187-2. Like, we're so used to Justin Herbert having these 300-yard passing games, but Miami Dolphins have a good defense and special teams. So, honestly, when West Coast teams go to the East Coast, they have a harder time. So, I think Justin Herbert will bounce back, but things didn't line up in his favor just because of the travel, because of the defense. I mean, he's a rookie still, so you have to give him that. But overall, not a terrible fancy outing for him. And then when it goes to like the rushing, like I said, earlier that Jordan Howard was a healthy scratch for this game, so they gave Salvin Ahmed the bulk of the carries. He had 21 carries for 85 yards and a touchdown. So I think as long as Matt Breida's out, as long as Gaskins is out, I think Ahmed is the guy that you can play. I mean, he's gaining the workload. And when it comes to this part of the season, and you have injuries and bye weeks, you need workload. And as long as Breida and Gaskins is out, Ahmed is the guy that you want to maybe try to pick up if he's available. When it comes to the Chargers, Justin Jackson was put on IR this past week, and Kalen Ballage had the majority of the carries. He had 18 carries for 68 yards. I mean, this is a guy that you're able to plug and play, and he gave you a decent outing. He had another 5 receptions for 34 yards. So Kalen Ballage, I mean, I know he's been a kind of a fancy joke because he was on the Jets and the Dolphins with Adam Gase, but he's actually doing pretty good with the Chargers. So very good outing from him. Keenan Allen, it's a quiet day. He was 3 for 39 and a touchdown. He still had that touchdown, but just overall, not what we usually see from Keenan Allen. Mike Williams had a very quiet day. He's only 2 for 38. I think overall this team was just kind of overwhelmed with the Miami Dolphins defense, the travel and all that. But I can see the Chargers bouncing back, next week. All right, so let's go to the Buffalo Bills versus Arizona Cardinals. And if you watch this game, and this was a crazy finish. I mean, it was back and forth all game long. At the end of the game, you saw the Bills march down the field, and Stephon Diggs presumably scored the game-winning touchdown, put him ahead. And then you're like, okay, Kyler Murray wants a few seconds left. He needs to be able to make something happen, get the ball down the field. They're able to do that. And on the very last play, they were able to throw this Hail Mary up to DeAndre Hopkins. And somehow DeAndre Hopkins comes down with this touchdown pass and catch. And it's like just a crazy finish. One of the most exciting games that I've watched, like an ending that I've watched in a very long time. Just crazy. I was just looking at my TV in disbelief on how this game ended. But overall, from a fantasy standpoint, though, Josh Allen had a very good game. He gave you 2 touchdowns passing. And then you had, Kyler Murray, he, gave you a touchdown passing, but he also gave you 2 touchdowns on the ground. And then Kyler Murray, he's a guy that he's too good. Like, everyone kind of wants to compare him to Russell Wilson, but Kyler Murray, to me, he is just so fast. Like, it is a cheat code to have almost a running back and a quarterback in one player, because that's presumably what he is. I mean, this is what Lamar Jackson was last year, but I think Kyler Murray's just a better passer. So I think like what Kyler Murray's doing right now, I think he has like 10 touchdowns on the ground. I mean, I think Dalvin Cook is like the next closest with rushing touchdowns. So it's crazy to see a quarterback have this much success on the ground, and it feels like you just can't stop it. Like it is crazy. Kyler Murray, I mean, I will not be surprised if he is now leading in the MVP race. I mean, this guy is just unstoppable. When it comes to Kenyon Drake was back, so if a lot of people might have played Kenyon Drake, he did have 100 yards on the ground, not bad. Chase Edmonds, he was a guy that his upside was capped, because obviously if Kenyon Drake was back, Kenyon Drake is the starter. And Chase Edmonds in the beginning of the year was playing a lot better than Kenyon Drake. So there was talk about Kenyon Drake being benched for Chase Edmonds. But I guess the coaching staff for the Cardinals do not think the same way. They still think Kenyon Drake is the go-to guy. I mean, he has 16 carries to Chase Edmonds 8. So it's one of those things where if you have Kenyon Drake and you played him, you had a decent outing. He did have a fumble, so he lost a couple points there due to the fumble. When it comes to the Buffalo Bills, I mean, Zach Moss continues to lead the team with carries in the last few weeks. I mean, he had 7 carries for 20 yards, not a big game, but he had 3 more carries than Devin Singletary. Devin Singletary was a complete no-show yesterday. He only had 15 yards on the ground, then he gave you another -5 yards passing on receiving. So not a very good game overall for the Buffalo Bills backfield. When it comes to the Buffalo Bills, now, who would have thought in the beginning of the week that Cole Beasley would have 11 catches for 109 yards and a touchdown on 13 targets? I mean, no one would. You look at that game, you think Stephon Diggs was the one who played better fantasy-wise, but it wasn't. Cole Beasley was the top guy this week, and good for him. I mean, he's definitely a underrated guy. He's a guy that, honestly, with John Brown, I expected John Brown to be better in the sense of like he's still dealing with some nagging injuries. So, but to see Cole Beasley lead the Bills was kind of interesting. On the Arizona side of the ball, DeAndre Hopkins, other than that, he was pretty quiet until that last catch of the game. You got your touchdown and a long presumably reception, but he was having a pretty quiet game. And for the people who play Christian Kirk, I mean, Christian Kirk was on fire for the last few weeks, and I saw a lot of people play Christian Kirk this week, and they were disappointed because he does not play up to par. He had 4 receptions for 27 yards and 6 targets. So just a overall bad game from Christian Kirk, because I had dropped him in my main league, and I thought about playing him because I wasn't sure. I had Tyreek Hill on a bye, but I ended up playing actually Chase Claypool and T. Higgins, which worked out for me this week. But it's one of those things where it's you want to trust these guys, like people who play Curtis Samuel or play Christian Kirk. Like you saw production in the last few weeks, and you saw like it just kind of not work in your favor this past week. And then moving on to the Seahawks versus the Rams. I don't know what's going on with the Seahawks, man. The Seahawks and Russell Wilson. I mean, the Rams won this game 23-16, but this honestly wasn't even close. The Rams defense was just unstoppable yesterday. And Russell Wilson, I mean, a lot of turnovers, didn't throw a touchdown pass, just looked average. I mean, everyone's talking about how, Russell Wilson was this MVP candidate, which I still think that. I don't think that he's, just because he had a couple bad games doesn't mean that he's not in the MVP conversation. It's just the problem is that Russell Wilson needs defense. He needs the defense to make some stops, give him better field position. When that defense can't stop anything, when they can't get sacks, they can't create turnovers, you're not going to win football games. And we're now seeing the Seahawks that are one-dimensional, because you got to look at what happened yesterday. Jalen Ramsey just shut down DK Metcalf. And I know DK Metcalf, he's been a stud all year, but Jalen Ramsey gets paid what he gets paid to shut down number 1 wide receivers, and he did that pretty effectively yesterday. So overall, fantasy-wise, I mean, Jared Goff had no touchdowns. Russell Wilson, he did give you some rushes for 8 rushes for 60 yards, so not bad here. When it comes to I had some questions about, do you play DJ Dallas this week, and I was concerned about what's going to happen. Like last week, Travis Homer led in snaps Alex Collins and then DJ Dallas were all in rotation. And this week, Alex Collins had the most carries. He had the 43 yards and a touchdown, but Travis Homer went out with an injury. DJ Dallas, he only had 2 carries as well. But Alex Collins may be the guy that's going to be there. And now the Seahawks play the Cardinals on Thursday night, so there could be a chance that Chris Carson or Carlos Hyde comes back. But maybe this is the whole plan all along, was to get those 2 back for this Thursday night game since they had a short week. But overall, I mean, they don't have a ground game, right? They obviously, if a receiver gets shut down, like DK Metcalf has, they're gonna be very one-dimensional. So not a good formula for the Seahawks right now. Hopefully they can turn it around. On the Rams side of the ball, Cam Akers, he was the guy who led the backfield with 10 rushes for 38 yards. Now Malcolm Brown was the one who had the touchdowns. He had 2 touchdowns. I mean, Darrell Henderson had a touchdown as well. But you saw the carries go to Cam Akers. So this is exactly the formula that I don't like when it comes to having a 3-headed monster in the backfield, just like the Ravens. It's just hard to determine who's going to be the guy. But Malcolm Brown was the guy who came up on top with the 2 touchdowns. From a receiving standpoint, Tyler Lockett, not a bad game. He was 5 for 66 on 9 targets. Now, talk about DK Metcalf. He was 2 for 28 on 4 targets. So, I mean, that's not good to the people who played DK Metcalf. On the Rams side of the ball, Josh Reynolds actually out-targeted everybody. He was 8 for 94 and 10 targets. So, wonder what's going on with Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods. And honestly, I don't know. I mean, Cooper Kupp still had 7 targets. He was 5 for 50. But Josh Reynolds has been out-targeting Robert Woods, recently. So that's an interesting development as well. But maybe this is just one of those games where, obviously Robert Woods is the number 1 for the Rams. So obviously the number 1 corner is going to play up against Robert Woods. And that leaves Josh Reynolds with the opportunity to be able to be in the slot and get more opened and have the mismatches and all that. So that's understandable. So it'll be interesting to see how Robert Woods is being dealt the ball going forward. And then Tyler Higbee actually had a good game. He was 3 for 60, and Gerald Everett was 2 for 27. So not great games, but it was good to see Tyler Higbee kind of have some relevance there, because a lot of people have dropped him. But going on to the Saints versus the 49ers, the Saints won this game 27-13. Not a lot to talk about other than, obviously I talked about Drew Brees in the beginning of the show. He's going to be out for some time due to the ribs injury and the fractures and the collapsed lung. But I think the real story here is Alvin Kamara. Alvin Kamara he just dominated this game. He had 3 touchdowns. Now, he didn't do a lot on the ground. Latavius Murray led the team with 57 yards on the ground, but Alvin Kamara, he had 2 rushing touchdowns and he had a receiving touchdown. He led the receiving for the Saints for 7 for 83 on 8 targets. Michael Thomas, I don't know what's going on with Michael Thomas. Michael Thomas was 2 for 27 on 7 targets. Now, you can say this could have been because Drew Brees, got knocked out at halftime. But still, this is a elite wide receiver in the NFL. We all know Michael Thomas is elite. I'm not understanding why he obviously is getting double teamed. He obviously needs, to find ways to be able to get him open like the Saints, but not encouraging to see him get 7 targets and only 2 catches. Now on the 49ers side of the ball, Brandon Ayuk, he was 7 for 75 in a touchdown, so that was good. He had 14 targets, so as long as Deebo Samuel is out, I think that Brandon Ayuk is definitely a good fantasy option. Jordan Reed, he had a good game. He was 5 for 62. Not the greatest tight end outing, but honestly, tight ends all week long. I'll go through all my fantasy studs at the end of the show, and I'm gonna let you know what the top score was, and it was pretty ugly throughout the whole tight end position. But at least he played this game effectively. He had a very good catch. I don't know if you saw it, but he had a good shoestring catch. So Jordan Reed is still a good option, knowing that what Kittle meant to that offense compared to what Jordan Reed can provide. As long as he stays healthy, I think he's still a good fantasy option. And on the ground for the 49ers, we're trying to figure out who's going to be the guy, McKinnon or Hasty. The answer was McKinnon this week. He had 18 carries for 33 yards. So he only had 1.8 yards per carry. So obviously not very good. Hasty went out with an injury. So as long as these guys are still injured, Jerick McKinnon as of right now is the guy that you want to play in the 49ers backfield. But overall, just a very, very kind of quiet game fantasy-wise other than if you had Alvin Kamara. And then going on to the Steelers versus the Bengals. I mean, this was a blowout. It was 36-10. Joe Burrow, I mean, he's a rookie. He didn't have a bad game. I mean, he had 213 yards and a touchdown. So the good thing is that he didn't have any turnovers against one. The Steelers is the best defense in the league. Big Ben had a great game, 333 yards and 4 touchdowns. I was a little concerned about Big Ben because I have him in my main league. I play my 2 quarterbacks is Joe Burrow and Big Ben, and this is one of the games I watched mostly at the later slot. But I was concerned because of not because of the COVID stuff, but because that he was dealing with the knee injury, and to see him play like he played makes me feel a lot more comfortable about what he's going to be like going forward. So Big Ben, very good fantasy outing. When it comes to the rushing, honestly, James Conner, it's not very effective. I'm not sure what's going on with James Conner, but he's a very talented player. But it looks like this is going to be a year where it's going to be all passing and a little bit of James Conner kind of put in there. But overall, I mean, I think this is going to be a pass heavy offense going forward. I mean, if you look at what happened from the receiving standpoint, I had mentioned in my start-sit episode that as long as Big Ben plays, you're going to play all your Steelers wide receivers. And that's exactly what happened. All Steelers wide receivers had touchdowns. They all were effective. They all had good fantasy outings. I mean, Deontay Johnson, 6 for 116 and a touchdown, 11 targets. Juju was 9 for 77 for a touchdown and 13 targets. And Chase Claypool was 4 for 56 on 10 targets. So, like I said, this was a great game if you played any of your Steelers. On Cincinnati side of the ball, T. Higgins was a guy who came up on top. He was 7 for 115 and a touchdown on 9 targets. So, if you played these guys in this game, you actually had a really good outing. So overall, you should be happy with that. And then moving on to the Sunday Night Football game. So we had the Patriots versus the Ravens. The Patriots won this game 23-17. Pretty quiet game overall. You had Lamar Jackson. He had 2 touchdowns. So not a bad outing from him. Cam Newton had a decent game. He had a passing touchdown plus a rushing touchdown. You had Lamar Jackson leading carries with 11 carries for 55 yards. Then Gus Edwards had 7, J.K. Dobbins had 5, and Mark Ingram had 5. So they evenly distributed the ball amongst the running backs. No one had a touchdown, but you saw Gus Edwards come out on top with the carries and the yards. Damian Harris, great game from him, 22 carries on 121 yards. So I think that he's a viable option because this is kind of what you see them going to. I mean, Rex Burkhead had a very good game. Damian Harris had a very good game. You had Jacoby Myers. He was 5 for 59. He didn't have a receiving touchdown, but he had a passing touchdown. So overall, I mean, not a bad outing. You had on the receiving side of the ball for the Ravens, Willie Snead. He was, the one who led with five receptions for 64 yards and the 2 touchdowns. So very interesting to see that because obviously you got Hollywood Brown. These are the guys that should be the guys who should have more fantasy relevance, but looks like Lamar Jackson or Willie Snead started having a little connection going on there. So I think that Willie Snead may be a good pickup for waiver wires, but I'll be talking about him tomorrow. But I do think that when you see players scoring touchdowns, you see him being involved in the offense. Obviously Marquise Brown is the number 1, so obviously he gets more of the attention. So Willie Snead gets, the lesser part of the coverage. So I think that Willie Snead may be a sneaky fantasy option. Now, it's always going to be based on matchups and based on opportunities and what options you have for you. But with bye weeks and injuries happening, I do think that could be a decent option for you. But that's it with all the reactions and all the games for Week 10. Don't forget, we do have the Vikings and the Bears tonight. So obviously, if you have Dalvin Cook, hopefully he's a guy who can win in your matchup. So if you tell me what you need to win tonight. I mean, obviously you got Jefferson going. The fantasy relevant players you got are Cook, you got Thielen, you got Justin Jefferson. You may be playing Jimmy Graham or maybe Kirk Cousins, but let me know what you need down below and tell me what you need to win for this week. But that's all the matchups. And now going on to the fantasy studs for Week 10. At quarterback, Tom Brady led all quarterbacks this week with 38 points. Then you had Big Ben. He was second with 37.4 points. And then Josh Allen was third with 33.68 points. Now going to the running back, Alvin Kamara led all running backs with 34.8 PPR points. Then you got Josh Jacobs at 29.6. And then Nyheim Hines was third with 28.5. At wide receiver, Cole Beasley was the number one fantasy wide receiver for Week 10. So let that sink in for a second. He had 27.9 PPR points. DeAndre Hopkins was second at 25.7. And you had Stephon Diggs with 25.3. And then going on to the tight end. So I had said earlier, like, this is how ugly the tight end position was this week when it comes to fantasy. Rob Gronkowski led all tight ends with 13.1 PPR points. Mark Andrews was second with 13.1. And then Hunter Henry had 13. So that was the top scorers for this week. And I add honorable mention at Cameron Brate for the Bucs was at 12.1. So obviously Travis Kelce wasn't playing this week. He was on a bye. You know, we had a lot of just low scoring at the tight end position this week. That's kind of how it goes. But it's one of those things where a wacko week. I mean, to see Cole Beasley lead the wide receivers and to see Gronk to be the guy who leads with only 13 points, it's just an odd week. So hopefully all that stuff kind of gets evened out when Week 11 comes around. But that's it for today. You know, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss any more episodes. And on tomorrow's episode, I'll be talking about all the waiver wire pickups for Week 11. So if you'd like to have any questions, leave a comment below. If you'd like to email me, you can email me at chip@gridironfantasyfootball.com. If you want to follow us on social media, you can find me on Twitter and Facebook at the Gridiron Pod. You can find me on Instagram at Gridiron Fantasy Football. So, you know, that's it for today. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in tomorrow's episode. Take care.